He wore his uniform proudly, medals gleaming, hat tilted just right, a living reminder of sacrifice and service. But as he stepped onto that airplane, the applause he expected never came. Instead, eyes narrowed. Whispers followed. Within minutes, a man who once defended his country was being escorted off a flight. Not for what he did, but for who he was. Passengers stared, phones recorded. His dignity hung in the air like smoke, thick and heavy. How does a decorated veteran end up humiliated thousands of feet from home for simply taking his seat?
Before that flight, James Carter was just another passenger. But behind his calm smile lay decades of honor and discipline. A 62-year-old Army veteran, he'd served in 3 deployments, earned multiple medals, and carried scars that never made it onto any uniform. After years of service, he'd finally settled into quiet retirement, mornings spent walking his dog, afternoons helping at the local community center, evenings watching the sunset with a cup of black coffee and a deep sense of peace. That day, James was flying to Atlanta to speak at a school event honoring veterans. His duffel bag held a neatly folded uniform, the one he wore on his final day of service, the same one his students were eager to see. For him, the trip wasn't just another flight. It was a reminder that, even off the battlefield, respect and dignity still mattered.
But the world doesn't always see past the surface. As he waited to board, he noticed the glances, some curious, some cold. Maybe it was the color of his skin. Maybe the uniform that said he'd earned his place in a world that often tried to deny it. Still, James brushed it off. He'd faced worse. He believed in people, in fairness. When his boarding group was called, he walked with quiet pride, ticket in hand, heart steady. He had no idea that the next few hours would test everything he believed about justice, respect, and equality. Because somewhere beyond that gate, in the narrow aisles of an airplane, a moment was waiting. One that would strip away the polite smiles and expose the truth about how far we still have to go. The boarding gate beeped as James scanned his ticket, a sound he'd heard countless times before. He walked down the narrow jet bridge, his duffel over his shoulder, his uniform jacket neatly tucked inside. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and recycled air. He found his seat, 14A, window. As he placed his bag in the overhead bin, a man across the aisle frowned. James caught his gaze for a second, cold, sharp, judging. He turned away, settling quietly into his seat. Minutes later, the hum of boarding filled the air. Passengers shuffling, seatbelts clinking, babies crying. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. A flight attendant approached James, her expression polite but uneasy. "Sir, could you step into the aisle for a moment?" she asked softly. Confused, James complied. She lowered her voice, glancing around. "We've had a complaint. A passenger says you're sitting in the wrong seat." James blinked. 14A, he said, holding up his ticket. The seat number matched perfectly. The attendant frowned slightly. "I understand, sir, but we'll need to verify that." He felt a stir of discomfort. The man across the aisle smirked, the kind of smirk that said he'd done something. Passengers began to notice. Whispers spread. The attendant checked the ticket again, then radioed to another crew member. Moments later, a second attendant arrived, this one with tighter lips and colder eyes. They asked for his ID, his military ID. James handed it over, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear but from disbelief. Was this really happening? He'd been thanked by generals, honored by mayors, and now he was being questioned like a criminal for sitting in his assigned seat?
Then came the final blow. The captain's voice echoed from the cockpit, calm, detached, final. "We're going to have to ask the passenger in 14A to deboard until we can resolve the issue." A collective murmur spread through the cabin. Some passengers avoided his eyes. Others filmed quietly with their phones. James stood frozen, his dignity warring with disbelief. He could feel his heartbeat pounding against the medals he once wore proudly. As he stepped off the plane, Escorted by 2 attendants, the whispers turned into silence, the kind that cuts deeper than words. No one stood up, no one spoke. He'd been removed from a plane he'd paid for, while the man who complained sat comfortably in his seat.
In the terminal, James waited. 30 minutes, then 45. No apology, no explanation, just empty reassurances that procedures were being followed. Finally, a supervisor approached, flustered and hesitant. She glanced at the computer, then back at him. Mr. Carter, it seems there was a misunderstanding. You were in fact assigned to 14A. A misunderstanding. 2 words that erased an hour of humiliation.
They offered him a seat on the next flight, a quiet attempt to smooth over the chaos. But as James walked back down that same gate later, every step felt heavier. The same passengers avoided his gaze. The same man still sat smugly across the aisle. And as the plane finally lifted off, James stared out the window, wondering, how many medals does a black man have to earn before the world finally lets him sit in peace? Because sometimes the battlefield isn't overseas. It's right here, at 30,000 feet.
The flight continued in silence, but the air was heavy, thick with tension and unspoken judgment. James sat still, hands clasped, staring at the seatbelt sign as if it could anchor him in a world that suddenly felt hostile. Every now and then, he caught the same man's reflection in the window, the one who had called the attendant. The man looked smug, satisfied.
James's throat tightened, but he refused to lower his head. He had stood through storms far worse than this. Mortar fire, sleepless nights and desert heat, friends lost in combat. But this was different. This was a quiet war, fought with glances, assumptions, and silence. When the plane landed in Atlanta, most passengers rushed off quickly, eager to forget the uncomfortable scene they'd witnessed. James waited, letting them pass. But as he stood to retrieve his bag, the same man brushed past him, muttering under his breath, just loud enough for James to hear, "You people always think you deserve special treatment." It hit like a punch. Not the words themselves, but the casual venom behind them. The way he said "you people," as if James's entire identity could be reduced to the color of his skin. Something inside James broke. He turned, his voice low but steady. "I didn't serve this country for special treatment," he said quietly. "I served so people like you could fly without fear." The man froze, maybe from guilt, maybe from shock, but James didn't wait for a response. He walked off the plane, back straight, heart pounding. Cameras followed, whispers trailed.
As he stepped into the terminal, the crowd parted slightly, some avoiding his eyes, others staring in shame. A young boy, no older than 10, saluted him as he passed. James paused, nodded, and for the first time since boarding that flight, he smiled. Because even in humiliation, dignity doesn't die easily. But the moment wasn't over, not yet. What happened next would transform one man's silent pain into a national conversation that no one could ignore.
By the time James reached baggage claim, the incident had already gone viral. Passengers who recorded the confrontation had posted it online, and within hours, the clips spread like wildfire. Headlines called it the veteran who was kicked off a plane. Comments flooded in, some outraged, others defensive, but one thing was certain, people were watching. The airline issued a formal apology, calling it a misunderstanding. They offered compensation, free tickets, even a personal call from an executive. But James didn't want any of it. What he wanted couldn't be packaged or refunded. He wanted acknowledgement, not for himself, but for every person who'd ever been quietly humiliated and told to move along. He spoke publicly days later, standing before a crowd of students at the very event he'd flown to attend. His voice trembled, not with anger, but with conviction. He told them that racism doesn't always wear a hood or carry a gun. Sometimes it smiles politely, then questions your seat. Sometimes it hides behind procedure. The room was silent, the kind of silence that sinks into your bones. And when he finished, the entire hall rose to its feet. They didn't just see a veteran that day. They saw a mirror reflecting a truth this country still struggles to face.
Weeks later, the airline changed its staff training policies, citing the James Carter incident as a catalyst. But James never boasted. He simply went back to his quiet life, walking his dog, watching sunsets, wearing his uniform on special days. A silent reminder that dignity, once tested, becomes unbreakable. Because in a world quick to forget, his story stood as a warning and a question. How many more misunderstandings will it take before equality stops being an apology and starts being a reality? If this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Because silence, too, has a cost, and it's one we can't afford to keep paying.